Somewhere over the flat, invisible miles between Los Angeles and Chicago, the plane shuddered like a drunk trying to find his car keys. Marcus Hill felt the first hard jolt in his seat before his mind even registered it, and then the coffee in the cup of the woman across the aisle leapt into the air, splattering her silk blouse. She gasped, dabbing at herself, but Marcus's attention had already shifted, not to the turbulence, not to the seatbelt sign flashing overhead, but to the eyes. He'd noticed them the moment he boarded, a subtle glance from a flight attendant, the sideways tilt of a passenger's head. Now, in first class, surrounded by leather seats and overpriced champagne, he realized he was the only black passenger up here, and the looks weren't going away. They weren't hostile, not openly. More like curious, the kind of curious that wonders if you wandered into the wrong neighborhood by mistake. Mid-40s, Detroit-born, Marcus had seen it before in boardrooms, hotel lobbies, even the produce aisle. Ex-Army medic, now a logistics consultant who kept mostly to himself, he had a way of reading a room without making a fuss. Right now, the room was 30,000 feet up, and its mood was as clear as the plastic windows, polite on the surface, twitchy underneath. A flight attendant with an immaculate bun had paused by his seat earlier, asking if he needed help finding the right row, her smile stretched thin like she'd practiced it in a mirror. His seatmate, a heavy-set man in a pinstripe suit, had done the subtle purse shuffle, moving his expensive leather briefcase closer to the window side, like Marcus might suddenly sprout kleptomaniac tendencies at altitude. Marcus didn't say anything. He'd learned a long time ago that sometimes silence was the sharper weapon. The cast of characters in this flying theater was beginning to show themselves. Across the aisle, Eleanor, an elderly widow with silver hair set in a no-nonsense bob, was holding court with anyone who'd listen. Her voice had the sharpness of someone who'd corrected more than a few store clerks in her time. 2 rows ahead sat Rick, a tech executive with the smug, self-satisfied grin of a man who thought turbulence was something that only happened to other people. And just a few minutes ago, a nervous young woman named Tamara from economy had edged past the curtain to use the first-class restroom, clutching her toddler's blanket like it was a passport. The turbulence worsened, starting as a steady hum and then jerking the plane sideways hard enough to make people grab their armrests. A coffee cart clattered violently in the aisle, cups and sugar packets scattering like dice on a table. Someone swore under their breath. Marcus caught a faint whiff of something warm, maybe electrical, but told himself it was just the kitchen heaters working overtime. Then the plane banked suddenly, so sharply that Eleanor's handbag slid to the floor and Rick's phone skidded down the aisle. Gasps turned into shouts and the seatbelt sign dinged insistently overhead. The coffee cart tipped completely, crashing into a bulkhead with a sound that cut through the noise like a gunshot. Somewhere behind them, a baby started wailing. A hiss came from above as the oxygen masks dropped, dangling in front of startled faces like grotesque Christmas ornaments. The cabin air felt heavier, tighter. Marcus's instincts, the kind honed in desert heat and blood-soaked tense years ago, kicked in before his thoughts could catch up. He scanned the people around him, reading fear in their posture, their hands fumbling for masks, their wide, darting eyes. It was the first moment anyone stopped noticing that Marcus didn't belong in first class. Now it was just a matter of who could keep their head and who couldn't. He reached for his own mask, tightened it, and his mind was already moving 3 steps ahead. Somewhere deep in his bones he knew, this wasn't going to be just turbulence. By the time the first-class cabin tipped into full chaos, with Eleanor trying to help the woman beside her, Rick barking orders that no one followed, and Tamara clutching the bathroom door frame like a lifeline, Marcus was already unbuckling his seatbelt. The plane might still be in the air, but on some level the fight to keep everyone alive had already begun. The first whiff of it was faint, but it cut through the recycled cabin air like a warning no one wanted to hear. Burnt plastic, sharp and chemical, the kind of smell that always means something electrical is going wrong. It seeped in just under the tang of spilled coffee and nervous sweat. Flight attendants were suddenly louder, their voices pitched high and clipped, barking instructions to fasten belts and stay calm. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, too calm to be comforting, announcing an emergency descent into Denver. The words precautionary and minor issue floated in the air, but Marcus could hear the speed in his delivery. Reactions were instant and all over the map. One man in the front row closed his eyes and started mumbling a prayer like he'd rehearsed it for this exact moment. 2 women behind Marcus argued over whether they should grab their carry-ons. Someone else demanded a drink, whiskey now double, as if the right shot could make physics take a coffee break. Others just sat frozen, clutching armrests, waiting for the situation to somehow unhappen. Marcus shifted in his seat and glanced toward the galley. That was where the smell was thickest. A thin, almost polite ribbon of smoke curled out from behind the service door, winding its way into the aisle. He knew the look of an electrical fire, the stubborn, smoldering kind that doesn't need open flames to ruin your day. He also knew that if it reached the wrong place, minor issue would be the last lie the captain told them. The crew was moving fast but not fast enough, and Marcus quickly saw why. One attendant was sitting on the floor near the bulkhead, clutching her arm with her face pale and tight. Another was gone completely, probably up front with the pilots. That left just two trying to manage the cabin and keep people from losing their minds. He stood, leaning into the aisle for a better look, but Rick shifted to block him, one arm out like a security guard at a VIP rope. "Sit down, let the professionals handle this," he said, voice dripping with the confidence of someone who had never been in a real emergency. Marcus didn't answer. He simply moved past him, not roughly but with enough force to make Rick step back. The first thing he did was start getting obstacles out of the way. A half-toppled cart was blocking the aisle, so he shoved it flush against the galley wall. A woman's roller bag had skidded into the walkway. He hauled it into an overhead bin and slammed it shut. Eleanor was wrestling with her seatbelt, the clasp twisted, so he leaned down, freed it, and tightened it across her lap. She didn't thank him out loud, but her eyes softened for a moment before she turned her gaze forward again. Not everyone was on board with him taking charge. One man further back in first class kept muttering that Marcus wasn't crew, as if that was the only credential that counted when the air was starting to taste like a melted circuit board. A younger woman, though, grabbed her own bag and stowed it after seeing Marcus clear the aisle. That was how it always went in a crisis. Some people followed the person who moved first, others stayed loyal to the hierarchy, even if it was failing them in real time. The smoke thickened, hanging low enough now that the reading lights above seemed haloed in gray. Marcus could hear the faint crackle from behind the galley door, a sound like someone crumpling cellophane. He glanced down the length of the plane and spotted something worse. Toward the rear, the aisle was clogged with fallen baggage and a collapsed service cart. If the fire spread and they needed to get people out fast, that would be a death trap. The captain's voice came again, this time with less sugarcoating. "Brace for landing." The descent steepened, the engines roaring like a windstorm pressed against the windows. Oxygen masks swung wildly on their cords, the smell of fuel pushing in as they dropped lower. Marcus gripped the seat back in front of him, bracing his legs. The cabin was a blur of shaking hands, whispered prayers, and the dull, distant beep of some alarm from the cockpit. When the wheels hit the runway, it was like being punched in the chest. The impact jolted everyone forward, seatbelts biting into ribs, loose items skidding down the aisle. A violent bounce, then another, and finally the gut-twisting lurch of brakes fighting to stop thousands of pounds of metal and fear. The smell of fuel was stronger now, too strong to ignore. Marcus's instincts told him this was just the beginning. The plane screeched to a halt in an awkward sideways position on the runway, the kind you never see in those glossy airline safety videos. Outside, there were flashing lights and frantic shadows darting across the tarmac, but inside the air was thick with haze. It had that stinging bite in the nose and throat that made every breath feel shorter than it should. The captain's voice crackled over the speakers, but it was half static, half words. Something about staying calm and awaiting crew instructions. Then nothing but dead air. At the front, two flight attendants were wrestling with the door, trying to get the emergency slide deployed. The metal handle clanked, the seal gave a hiss, but nothing happened. One of them pulled again, harder, but the slide stayed stubbornly coiled. Behind them, the other door finally opened with a whoosh, the slide inflating into a yellow lifeline. People surged toward it, but the blockage at the jammed door created a wall of bodies, everyone craning to see, no one actually moving. It was that frozen moment, the one Marcus had seen before in combat zones, where hesitation becomes the real killer. People were looking for someone to tell them exactly what to do, and the longer they waited, the worse it got. He didn't think about protocol or whether some rulebook would approve. He just moved. He shoved past the cluster of passengers at the bad door, scanning for anything that could be used as a lever. "Something heavy," he barked, his voice cutting through the white noise of panic. No one moved until one of the attendants pointed toward the galley. Marcus lunged for the mounted fire extinguisher, yanked it free, and jammed the nozzle into the seam where the door's mechanism was stuck. One hard hit, then another, metal groaning against metal, and with a sharp crack the slide's latch gave way. The chute burst out, whipping into shape as the cold air from outside rushed in. Rick appeared at Marcus's shoulder, voice dripping with accusation. "You're making things worse. You could damage the..." Eleanor's voice cut in from somewhere behind him, sharper than the extinguisher's blow. "Shut it and move." That shut Rick up faster than Marcus could have. In the middle of the commotion, Marcus spotted Tamara. She was hunched over in her seat 2 rows back, fighting with the straps of a bulky car seat. Her toddler was squirming, coughing in the smoky air. Without a second thought, Marcus stepped back from the slide, crossed to her row and crouched down. His fingers worked faster than hers, popping the stubborn buckle, then lifting the kid into his arms. The child clung to him like a backpack, small hands gripping the collar of his shirt. By now, the haze was thicker, and the first licks of orange were visible through the small window near the rear of the cabin. The smell of burning fuel wasn't just a hint anymore, it was the kind of smell you didn't mistake for anything else. The urgency in Marcus's movements doubled. He turned toward the slide and started moving people out. He didn't shout "women and children first," or any other cliché. He just grabbed the ones who were moving slowest, the ones frozen in the aisle, and got them toward the opening. Some were coughing, some crying, some stiff with shock. Marcus kept the line moving, making sure no one tripped or tangled themselves in carry-ons. As the flow of passengers eased, one of the attendants grabbed Marcus's arm and yelled over the din, "Go! You've done enough, get out." He looked at her, then over her shoulder at the shadowy rear of the plane where the smoke was heaviest. He knew enough about fire to understand that visibility like that meant people could still be stuck, maybe unconscious, maybe just too scared to move. He handed Tamara's child back to her, gave the kids back a quick pat and turned away from the slide. Ignoring the shouted protest behind him, Marcus stepped back into the murk, heading toward the rear of the cabin. Whatever was left to do, it wasn't going to get done from the safety of the runway. Marcus pushed deeper into the rear cabin, the smoke thick enough now that every step forward felt like walking into a damp, gray wall. The screaming was a jagged background noise, sharp in some places, muffled in others as if the panic itself had been swallowed by the haze. Overhead lights flickered, casting shadows that made shapes shift in the corner of his vision. The air was hot, tasting of burnt insulation and spilled jet fuel, and each breath clawed its way down his throat. Economy was chaos. Some passengers were frozen in their seats, eyes wide and glassy, gripping armrests like the plane might still somehow be in the air. Others were on their feet, shoving and stumbling toward any direction that looked like escape. A few clutched bags to their chests as if they were life preservers, slowing everyone else behind them. The aisle was partially blocked by luggage that had fallen from overhead bins, along with a toppled catering cart lying sideways like an iron barricade. Marcus spotted movement low to the floor. An older man slumped against the side of a row, his chin dropped to his chest, lips blue-gray from lack of oxygen. He didn't hesitate. Dropping to one knee, Marcus hooked his arms under the man's and heaved, dragging him into the aisle. The man's shoes scuffed along the floor as Marcus pulled him forward, ignoring the jostling bodies and shouted curses from panicked passengers squeezing past. Halfway to the rear, Marcus caught sight of a young flight attendant pinned between 2 service carts that had toppled into each other. She was coughing hard, her hands pushing uselessly at the metal frame. Marcus set the older man against a seat, wedged his boot under one cart and shoved. The frame groaned and shifted just enough for him to pull her free. She stumbled forward, clutching his arm for a second before disappearing into the smoky blur toward the exit. Marcus turned back for the older man, slung an arm over his shoulder, and started guiding him toward the rear slide. With his free foot, he kicked and shoved debris out of the aisle, bags, loose trays, and a bottle of something that rolled stubbornly ahead of him. The further back they went, the hotter the air felt. Somewhere to his left, near the windows over the wing, a sharp metallic bang split the air. Someone screamed, "It's going to blow." Panic surged forward like a wave, bodies pressing harder toward the exits. Marcus gritted his teeth and kept moving, refusing to let the noise derail him. They reached the rear galley where the second slide had already deployed. The opening was a rectangle of gray daylight in the haze, framed by the frantic silhouettes of people climbing onto it. Marcus eased the older man into the arms of 2 other passengers who guided him to the chute. Instead of following, Marcus turned toward the rear lavatory. If someone had panicked and locked themselves in, they'd be invisible in this soup of smoke until it was too late. He pounded on the door, yanked it open, and found only the harsh fluorescent light glaring back at him. Satisfied, he pivoted toward the exit. The line was thinning now. Most of the passengers who could move had made it out. Through the haze he saw Tamara near the doorway, her child clutched tight against her chest. Her face was streaked with tears and soot, but when she saw Marcus she paused. For just a second, she leaned in and hugged him, awkward with the toddler between them but firm enough to be felt. Then she turned and climbed onto the slide, disappearing into the bright blur outside. Marcus took one last glance down the smoke-filled aisle, making sure no one else was left. The overhead bins hung open like gaping mouths, and the seats sat abandoned in rows, eerily still after the chaos. Satisfied it was empty, he stepped to the opening and swung his legs onto the slide. The rush of cold air hit him like a slap, followed by the fast, jarring ride down to the tarmac. He hit the ground running, momentum carrying him forward. Behind him, the aircraft groaned under its own weight, a deep metallic rumble that ended with a sudden flare of orange through the smoke. The heat rolled toward him even at that distance, a reminder that if he'd stayed inside a moment longer, the ending would have been different, for him and for the people he'd pulled out. The tarmac was a battlefield of noise and movement. Emergency crews moved in tight, rehearsed patterns, spraying thick white foam over the blackened shell of the plane. The air was heavy with the chemical tang of the extinguishing agents, mixing with the acrid bite of burned metal. Passengers, some barefoot, some still clutching handbags or coats, sat scattered across the grass beyond the runway lights. Many were coughing, shoulders shaking as they tried to clear the smoke from their lungs, their eyes red and streaming. Paramedics moved among them, checking pulses, shining lights into pupils, wrapping blankets around trembling bodies. Marcus stood a little apart, catching his breath. His clothes smelled like they'd been baked in an engine, his throat raw from smoke. The adrenaline was still there, buzzing low in his muscles, but now it was edged with fatigue. He watched the crews work, their floodlights painting the scene in harsh white as if daylight had been borrowed just for this emergency. Somewhere behind him, he heard a familiar voice amplified through a microphone. Rick was holding court in front of a news camera, gesturing toward the still smoking aircraft. His tone was calm, authoritative, the voice of a man who wanted everyone to know he had been in control. Marcus caught snippets, maintained order, helped guide people to safety, and felt a flicker of disbelief. He didn't need the spotlight, but watching someone rewrite the truth in real time had its own sting. A few feet away, Eleanor sat on the grass, a silver blanket draped over her shoulders. She was sipping water from a paper cup and watching Rick with a look that could peel paint. When Marcus glanced at her, she shook her head and muttered, "The wrong people getting credit. Happens every damn time." Before he could reply, a firefighter in a soot-streaked helmet walked over. The man's eyes flicked briefly toward the cameras before settling on Marcus. "You're the reason everyone from the rear made it out," he said quietly, almost like he didn't want to break whatever anonymity Marcus was clinging to. There was no ceremony in his tone, no grand pronouncement, just a simple fact stated between two people who'd both seen too many close calls. Marcus gave a small nod, the kind you give when you've heard enough to matter but don't have the energy for more. Standing there, Marcus knew he hadn't been on that flight by chance. Chicago wasn't just a stop for work or leisure. He'd been headed to a private memorial for the men in his army unit who died in a transport crash overseas years ago. A different plane, a different fire, and a different kind of smoke had taken them. He had been one of the lucky ones that time, pulled out of the wreckage before the worst of it. He'd promised himself, standing on a dusty airstrip half a world away, that if he was ever in a crisis again, he would not freeze. Not for orders, not for protocol, not for fear. That promise had sat in the back of his mind like a silent pact, waiting for the day it would be called in. Days later, back in Detroit, life felt quieter but not exactly normal. The news cycle had already moved on, and most of the headlines about the Denver emergency flight were filled with stock photos of the airline CEO shaking hands with first responders. Marcus sat on his worn couch in the dim light of his living room, a mug of coffee cooling beside him, when the local station ran a brief clip. It wasn't dramatic, just a 30-second segment naming him as one of the passengers who had assisted in the evacuation. The footage showed him in the background, leading a coughing older man toward the rear slide. No interviews, no fanfare. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. The message was from an unfamiliar number. He opened it to find a photo of a little boy with messy hair and a wide grin, an ice cream cone tilted dangerously in his hand. The caption underneath was short, "Thanks to you, he still has a dad. Tomorrow." Marcus stared at the picture for a long moment. The kid's face was pure joy, no trace of the smoke, fear, or chaos that had filled the plane. Just a kid eating ice cream on a sunny day, his future still wide open. Marcus leaned back into the couch, exhaling slowly. Sometimes you don't need the headlines. Just knowing you got them home is enough. The thought settled in quietly, final and certain, as he let the phone rest on the table and closed his eyes. Outside, the city moved on with its day, unaware that a promise made years ago had been kept in full. Fade out. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.